Hello again. Welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony.
And I'm Alan Singer.
Dr. Alan Singer, educated historian, regular on Media Watch. Always happy to have you with us. Lots of stuff in the news, folks. I don't know how much we can get to, but we'll try to put some perspective on it. Show's called Media Watch, so we'll lead with the media story, a media story, since there are a ton of them. Recent announcement that ABC President Kim Godwin is stepping down. And that's significant in that Kim Godwin was the first African-American female, probably the first African-American, any person to run a major network news division, right? President?
Right. She was president of the news department, of the news division. Correct.
President of the ABC Network News Division. And they made the announcement with fanfare. I think she actually had to get let out of a contract that she had with CBS in order to accept that ABC position. And so it was greeted with quite a lot of fanfare by Black professional journalists and other people who were not only surprised, but happy to see something like that happen. Well, we covered the story a few weeks ago, Bob, or maybe a couple months ago, when there was an announcement that there had been a switch or a reshuffling of the pecking order in the ABC News Division, and instead of reporting directly to the senior person, they put another layer of bureaucracy between the president of the ABC News Division and the key people, which basically, in a sense, was a demotion, which is exactly what we noted when we covered that story. And we might have even speculated on the fact that that may mean that she might not be staying there much longer after something like that happened. And lo and behold, we were correct. She made her announcement saying she's going to step down and actually going to move away from the business of professional journalism that she has been in since she got out of school 10 years ago. Now, Bob, we saw something about the National Association of Black Journalists, which welcomed her announcement of being made president. What did they have to say about what just transpired when she made her announcement of stepping down?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like it happened quickly too, because first there were these reports of problems with her management style or with her the way she did things at ABC, and they were reported mostly anonymously. They didn't have a real attribution as to who was saying it. And at the end of the day, Kim Godwin, who was no longer in charge of the division that she thought she was hired to be in charge of, I mean, she had somebody above her now, decided to go. The National Association of Black Journalists spotted this, obviously, and basically said, and I'll read from Richard Prince's Journal Isms, which is a great column. NABJ denounces reporting on ABC's Kim Godwin, reacting to a continuing stream of anonymous ABC News employees taking published potshots at ABC News President Kim Godwin. The National Association of Black Journalists Saturday defended, quote, the first Black woman to take the helm of a global news organization, unquote, and expressed concern, quote, over recent media reports that seem to be written with the intention of undermining her. And Eric, yeah, we said this before. When somebody has a manager promoted above them to manage the part of the corporation that they thought they were hired to manage, that usually is a signal that something is amiss. Somebody's probably going to leave or get fired. In this case, she left. And, you know, a great disappointment because we've had lots of glowing things to say about her during her short stint at ABC, which is still #1 in, I believe, the network evening news slot. So I don't get the issues that allegedly were against her, and I'm sorry to see her go, as obviously you are too.
Yeah, to put a tag on it, because we don't want to spend the whole show on it, but we've seen things like that before when people of color get promoted into positions of power, where the minute they walked in, all the knives are already pulled, and there are a whole cadre of people who are rooting to see them fail. And not only rooting to see them fail, actually taking steps to help make them fail. I've been there in newsrooms at network organizations and I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I wasn't in any position of power as being the president of a news division, but there were people who didn't want to see me be where I was when I was there. And Bob, I'm sure you experienced that in newsrooms you were in over the years.
Yes, well, I won't take up time with it, but yes, the same thing. But go ahead.
Her supporters said there was an old network of old boy network people who did not like her and did not want to see her succeed, and they were trying to sabotage her from day one. So it doesn't surprise me that they may have succeeded. That's been, but I took a quick scan of her resignation letter, and she basically said, I'm leaving with my hell high. We're number one, number one, number one, number one. And we've rolled out X, Y, and Z, and that's leading in where it is. And she ran down a litany of stuff. I said, wow, why would they want to let this woman go? Why would they put somebody over her? But that's me, and I'm coming from a personal bias because I've fought the battle she fought, not as high a level as she did, but I can understand it. So yeah, that's a good enough media watch story to talk about. And Prince actually put a good spotlight on the fact that,
yes, he did.
I believe his column highlighted the fact that predominantly the Wall Street Journal was about the only mainstream publication that actually covered that story properly, fairly, with integrity. So I'll give kudos to the Wall Street Journal, who I'm usually bashing. So segueing to the next media story. What's our next media story? Is it going to be about
PR, how they were.
the kangaroo court that's still going on down in Washington? Yeah, I was a week ago, I saw a story about the fact that the kangaroo court House subcommittee on whatever that's holding its kangaroo court, trying to fire presidents in education across the board, decided they were going to call in a whole bunch of people on the education level, but they also are calling in the president of NPR because of a bogus BS article that was written by some guy, some reporter, NPR Berliner, I think his last name was. Alan, you may have his first name handy, but he wrote this article claiming that NPR was biased in its coverage and came up with no examples, no proof, no nothing to back up his charge. And so basically NPR suspended him. They didn't fire him for coming out with a crackpot BS article, even though the rest of the media pushed back, including his NPR colleagues and other people who were not with NPR, who said what he's accusing NPR is what he just did in the article that he wrote. I forget what publication it came out in, but they castigated him for no evidence, no fairness, they basically laid into him. So even though NPR didn't fire him, they just suspended him, I think, maybe even with pay. I may be wrong, maybe without pay, but they suspended him briefly. But I guess the pushback was so strong across the board, he decided to resign. But he'd already done the damage, maligned the organization, and so now the kangaroo court in DC wants to call the president to testify, thinking they can get her scalp like they got the scalp of all those Ivy League presidents. So hopefully, if she goes down to the kangaroo court, she will be as prepared as, who was it? Drum roll, Alan. Talk to me about the chancellor of the New York City.
David Banks.
He talked about his visit to the kangaroo court.
He was prepared.
His name.
After the
what's our chancellor's name? Tell our viewing audience. No, I talked over you again.
David Banks.
Okay.
After the college presidents were attacked and really destroyed,
Shanghaied.
he went down ready, and he had his lines. First he said, we protect people against all bias. When they said, well, there have been incidents of anti-Semitism, he said, well, we've responded. People were suspended, teachers were disciplined. They said, well, give us specifics. And he said, I can't give you specifics. These cases are being adjudicated. These are personnel matters, but we did take action. But then I think his best line, well, two best lines. One, he said, is this a hearing to explore anti-Semitism, or is this your attempt to get a gotcha moment? And then the other thing he said is, you keep saying, well, there are anti-Semitic incidents in New York City public schools. He said, well, there are anti-Semitic incidents in the United States Congress. It's all Congress being investigated because of them. So
What was the answer? No answer.
Again, he was prepared. He went in to fight back. Look, there have been incidents, but this is not, it's not permeating the school system. It's really the same in what's going on in colleges. What you have is some media outlets, some politicians have been focusing on more extreme elements. People who've been shouting things, and there have people who've been shouting things that you could say are anti-Semitic. But the bulk of the protests and the bulk of the discussions in schools is very responsible. In schools, we try to engage kids from multiple perspectives to use evidence to understand what's taking place. And nobody is promoting anti-Semitism, certainly no responsible educators, that, some kids may then act extremely. Well, these are kids. But to accuse the school system of not responding is grossly irresponsible. It has.
No, look.
And the evidence is how few incidences there have been. When you can name the number of incidences at 3 schools, well, that means that in the other 1,000 schools, there weren't incidents.
Yeah, it's interesting because these demonstrations, there are all kinds of things about the demonstrations, part of which, before we forget, we should talk about how difficult it is to cover these demonstrations on campus. And Bob, let's give a tip of the hat to Columbia, Spectator, and the New Yorker. Tell our viewing audience about what a great crew they did to do excellent coverage at Columbia, and we can get back to varying Columbia.
Yeah, and I'll do it quickly. The students at Columbia, both from the student paper, the Columbia Daily Spectator, of which I'm an alumnus, I was sports editor back in the day, and the radio station WKCR FM, they both were on campus, whereas a lot of the media, the professional media, was outside at the gates. They couldn't get in. But the students did their best to cover what was happening on campus, even though the day that the police raided Hamilton Hall to get the people out who had taken the building, they pushed all of the student journalists out of the campus. The students themselves could not see what was happening. In any case, they did such a great job covering it, in any case, that the New Yorker, the iconic New Yorker magazine, gave the front page coverage to the Columbia Daily Spectator students, who did great job interviewing people, students on campus, whatever they could. And it was as good journalistic effort as I've ever seen. Same with the WKCO radio reporters. Some of them were locked out of their studios, and they almost went off the air because the police tried to clear the building. But they maintained themselves on the air terrifically.
They stuck to it. Like
they stuck to it.
That's the
students were great. They were admirable. So kudos to the Columbia Spectator, WKCR, and all the other students covering their protests on their campus. Keep it, keep it going.
The New Yorker was smart enough to actually reach out to the Spectator editors and say, hey, look, we know we can't get in there. Let's do some kind of collaboration. You guys do what you can, work with our staff. We'll give you our magazine, boom. And everybody said, yeah, that's what we need to do so we can get this story out to the wider audience. And so that was one hell of a hookup, as they used to say in the day. Great collaboration, phenomenal. Now, which gets us to how these demonstrations have been covered, not covered, policed or not policed, because there was an interesting story I saw in the New York Times about the fact that out on the West Coast, UCLA's campus, there was campus demonstration, and the kids said, okay, we're going to stay within ourselves. We're not going to respond to anything. We're going to stick to our script. and they had this anti-protest group that came up. And based on the Times' coverage, the anti-protest group began to try to wail away at these protesters unchecked, because the local college cops stood around and did nothing. The local police came by, took a look at what was going on, and just stood aside while these anti-protesters were wailing away at these protesters. It took hours before they actually moved in and tried to separate those people who were assaulting the protesters who were trying to be peaceful about their protest. It was just phenomenal, the fact that that could have happened like this. So the governor, when he found out about that, said, well, we need to investigate that. We need to find out what the heck that was all about. Why was the campus police not doing anything? Why was the police not doing anything? And so that gets to the question of policing, non-policing. When do they get called? Like, Alan, talk to me about that historical thing about the outside agitators, because Eric Adams was all busy running this party line about, yeah, well, we know that there are a bunch of outside, back in 1968, 1969, the cry was outside agitators, outside agitators. It's a crock of BS on my estimation. What was that Columbia University kid that was interviewed saying, I believe, let me not monopolize this, but I think PBS interviewed some of those on-campus students, and they said, look, we got to worry about how this is being covered. Well, this is saying outside agitators, but it's mainly students. Go ahead, Alan.
There were people from communities who agreed with the students who went to support them. But when you say that these outside agitators are the one who caused the problem, you're really saying your students are stupid. What are you saying? The students can't reach their own conclusions? Your college students can't figure out what they value? And a number of people have pointed out what the media, but really a reflection of the politicians, is they've tried to deflect from what's going on in Gaza so they could focus on what they don't like about the protests. But the reality is that the horrific things are going on in Gaza. And, you know, even Joe Biden is interesting, because Joe Biden attacked the violence and attacked the anti-Semitism without real evidence that there's significant violence in anti-Semitism. As you point out in UCLA, the violence was from the counter-protesters. But Joe Biden has finally come out and said, I support Israel 100%, but we're not going to give them more bombs if they continue the assaults that they're carrying out. What Israel has done is unacceptable for any country anywhere in the world.
Talk about the Thomas Friedman column, because there's nuances in there that, as Media Watch, we try to not just cherry pick, we just scoop it all up and try to relay it to our viewers. Friedman had some interesting points. I don't agree with all of them, but tell us a little bit about how he was parsing this whole campus riots demonstration, where he thinks they're right, where he thinks they're wrong, and not paying attention to what's actually going on in Gaza. Because there are other reporters who are saying there's atrocities going on that we're not reporting because we're covering a demonstration.
Friedman is a major foreign policy writer for the New York Times. Friedman is also a Jewish American. And Friedman has a very moderate voice on global issues. But what he wrote, this is a quote, "My problem is not that protests in general are anti-Semitic. I would not use that word to describe them. And indeed, I'm deeply uncomfortable as a Jew with how charge of anti-Semitism is thrown about on the Israel-Palestine issue. The charge of anti-Semitism is being used by Congress, by commentators, to silence protest, to say, oh, you can't protest because you're an anti-Semite. Congress even tried to, House of Representatives passed a bill that said that, defined anti-Semitism essentially disagreeing with Israel. And Jerry Nadler, who was a senior congressman from New York, from Manhattan, who was Jewish, said this makes everybody an anti-Semite, including me.
Because I disagree with Israel a lot of the times. Yes, I know where he's coming from.
it's become a weapon. And so that's why Friedman's voice was so important on this. Not a radical. He doesn't like the weaponization of the charge of anti-Semitism. And he said, I don't agree with a lot of the things demonstrators have said. You know, I support Israel. But on the other hand, what Israel has done in Gaza is grossly unacceptable on any terms.
Yeah.
And I think the Freeman.
Now, he's one of the journalists. I mean, he has as much respect as any journalist you're going to find writing for any newspaper. He does his research. He knows what he's talking about most of the time. You were talking about the agitators. The student reporters, both at WKCR and the Columbia Spectator, pushed back on that, and they said, "We know some of the people in Hamilton Hall. You know, we know there are students in there, and we know they knew what they were doing when they walked in. So, right, that's not the case. In students can think, as you said." And thank you, Alan. I believe last week you educated me on this. We were talking about the weapons Israel was using, and you said that some of them, in particular, were not pinpoint weapons. They're meant just to explode whatever it gets dropped on, and that's what they were dropping. And now we have the U.S. saying we're not going to give you those weapons because we're not going to be responsible for any further. We're already responsible for a lot of the destruction because it was our weapons, but we're not doing it anymore. And that's a sea change in U.S. policy.
And of course, you understand that most Democrats understand the nuance of what Biden is doing. Most Republicans are saying, how dare you stop giving weapons to Israel? They have a right to defend themselves. That's the party line. They have a right to defend themselves. And like you were mentioning, Ro Khanna, 2 shows back, who says, I don't have any problem with Israel defending themselves. I just don't want to give them weapons that's going to kill other people. We give them weapons
Precisely.
themselves all they want. I got no problem with that. Interestingly enough, part of Friedman's column, and I agree with 99% of it, what I thought he might have been slightly off was faulting the students for not giving enough voice to the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated on October 7th to cause this thing to start to begin with. He seemed to be thinking that they were giving Hamas a pass. And I'm not sure that all those students that are being pro-Palestinian demonstrators are trying to give Hamas a pass at all. And so that's the only caveat I had with his column. I was 99% in agreement with everything he had to say. I just don't want to broad brush those demonstrations as being supportive of the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated. I'm not sure that's what he was trying to say, but I read something that seemed to imply that he thought that they were not strong enough about calling Hamas out for the atrocity as much as they're calling Israel out for killing 30,000 plus innocent civilians while they're trying to get Hamas terrorists. And so that brings us to how do we get coverage of the atrocities? And that gives us to the fact that we can't, because the one great journalistic organization that actually had boots on the ground that could tell us what was going on, the Israelis just banned from coverage. When did they ban Al Jazeera officially? I know they shut down a couple of offices a week or 2 ago, but they put an official ban in, Alan, when?
Well, today that we're talking is now Thursday, May 9th. The Israeli cabinet made the decision on Sunday, which would have been May 5th, I believe.
Yes.
And Al Jazeera is really the only news outlet that has had boots on the ground in Gaza. And this is despite the fact, the Committee to Protect Journalists has reported that as of today, 97 journalists have died. Another 20 are either injured or missing, and 25 have been arrested. Al Jazeera's people have been the ones who are on the ground reporting despite the dangers that they face.
Some of whom have been killed. Some of whom have been killed.
Is trying to silence them. And we now know that one of the reasons is that also this weekend, the United Nations reported, it's been reported in some of the press, that they have found mass graves at some of the hospital sites. They've found 7 mass graves with 520 men, women, and children who were buried in them. Now, we don't know who perpetrated them because the Israeli army controls those sites. And without media in there to examine and expose, we're left in the dark.
Interestingly enough, Richard Prince's journalisms, again, because Richard's always on top of this stuff. First time I heard about this story was reading journalisms where he was quoting an LA Times reporter who was lamenting the fact that she had come across the information about 3, she didn't know about 7, 3 mass graves, and it had barely made a blip on anybody's radar. Her last name is Ali, I believe. I don't remember. Lorraine, was it Lorraine Ali, I believe, from the LA Times? He was quoting her story as being totally bent out of shape about the fact, as well she should, that more coverage on the campus demonstrations was gobbling up the news cycle than stories about the reports of mass graves being found in Gaza. 3 at the time, her report, 7 now from what your update is, Alan.
Right.
Look,
and we only have about a minute left.
if we want to return to Hamas and its atrocities, well, we have to find out who did these things. Because if they were done by Hamas, well, that just adds to the response.
And if they weren't done by Hamas, well, we need to know that too.
Yes.
So we've been saying it a long time. It's a difficult issue to cover, to discuss, to talk about. That's a repetition, redundancy, discuss and talk about. But anyway, there are lots of other stuff we thought we might want to talk about, but we're about out of time. So all I can say is thanks for joining us, folks. This has been Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
Alan Singer.
And I'm Bob Anthony. Catch up to us on YouTube at Media Watch EVT.
And folks, stay safe. We'll catch you the next time.